think it's actually quite illuminating if we give.
Go.
Okay, well, hi everyone. And this is a sort of follow-on from last week, so I'm not going to repeat some of the details which are very relevant from last week to make sense of this week. this week. But if you're just coming to it out of the blue, you might, if you have time, just have a look at last week's first, because it will set the scene for some of the things that I want to really emphasize today. And so today I want to talk about how cosmology comes alive. Now this is something which may seem a little bit sort of unusual or weird to us urban people, but I think it actually is a very ancient tradition of human ritual, and something which if we were doing more ritual with the sort of embeddedness that the people we're going to be talking about tonight do it, it transforms it from something that's a sort of series of actions that are repeated in a sort of mechanical way to something which really transports participants into another world of time. And in that other world of time, they collapse the distance between themselves and their origins, and in a sense become their own origins. And this is a tradition that's quite present among hunter-gatherers, and probably the most well-known example of it is in Australia, and the incredible rituals of the Australian original people or Aborigines, where they re-enter what they call, it's a lovely term, the everywhen, a time which is always present, but somehow beyond time, that connects the present with the deep past in an unbroken line, in a constant process of becoming, of unfolding. And and these dreaming rituals, in Australia, often reenact the primordial wanderings of the Dreamtime beings. They celebrate and focus on the particular potency or fertility that those mythical beings left as they formed the landscape which the people inhabit today. And so really get a sense of themselves as part of that landscape, as kangaroo or crow or whatever totem they are. So in a very interesting way in these hunter-gatherer societies, what people are doing is they're actually becoming their own gods. And what a contrast to the sort of jealous, punishing gods of the Neolithic, gods like Zeus or Yahweh, constantly meddling in human affairs, favoring some and punishing others. These moralizing gods, high gods of hierarchical, patriarchal societies, are eager to punish those that break their law or go against their word. And something else quite different is happening among these hunter-gatherers, and that's what I want to explore this evening with you. And of course, about 99% of human history, or Homo history, has taken place as hunter-gatherers, while just a tiny fraction has taken place in the Neolithic. So maybe we can contemplate a little bit tonight about these hunter-gatherer gods and just reflect upon, I hope I get to it at the end, but I've got a little surprise for you, which is something I've just been researching tangentially for the past few years, but it's just extraordinary. It's growing in size, scope, and scale in fascinating ways. But I'll get to that hopefully at the end. So by contrast to these sort of Neolithic gods, hunter-gatherer gods tend to be distant. They're not particularly interested in the goings-on of mortals. They're often ambivalent, trickster figures whose antics in mythical times are recounted in rather irreverent and humorous stories, which often mock them, while also acknowledging that they have this extraordinary power, this extraordinary potential to transform and change things. The BaYaka creator god is called Komba, and he lives in a camp somewhere in the forests, rather like somewhere behind me, you can see here. As when people have died, their spirits go to this camp, and as they approach Komba's camp in the forest, so just think about it, paradise is real life, it's not some other place. As they approach Komba's camp, Komba's dogs come to meet them. And if they are someone who ate people during their life, they are chased by the dogs, and they're forced to run down another path away from Komba's camp. And as they're running, they suddenly transform. If they were BaYaka, they transform into a small antelope called a blue duiker that everybody eats. Blue duikers, I always thought it was rather lucky for them. They have a brain about the size of my thumbnail. And everything eats them. Monkeys eat them, pigs eat them. Obviously the leopards and all the carnivores eat them too. But God, or Komba, will then let them get eaten again and again until he feels that, you know, okay, they've had enough now, and they can come to my camp. And then they come and enjoy being in his camp for a while. And in Komba's camp, if you haven't eaten people, you can enjoy all the nicest things of life. So there's honey every day, there's meat for feasting, really fatty meat. And every night people are singing, dancing, telling stories, and really doing all the things that people really enjoy doing in their everyday, ordinary lives. The other type of people that eat others are the neighbors of the BaYaka, the Bilo. And because the Bilo have this characteristic of being particularly obsessed about private property and particularly violent about protecting their private property from others, the BaYaka say that Komba just transforms them directly into gorillas when they die, and that all Bilo become gorillas, and that when you meet gorillas in the forest, you're actually meeting dead Bilo. And very often when people are just talking about gorillas, they won't even use the word gorilla, they just simply refer to them as Bilo, which is their word for villager, non-forest person. So life in Komba's camp is an idealized version of everyday earthly life. It's really, you know, quite important, I think, that you know, especially people from a Christian or Islamic tradition, or indeed Jewish, the Abrahamic traditions in general, understand that in these religions, paradise is not something that is somehow apart from earthly existence. Paradise is all the best things of earthly existence. And what that really translates at is that it is possible to inhabit paradise on earth. And this is something which I think we should give a lot more attention to, rather than all the suffering that is so often associated with being present here on this beautiful planet. Now, the BaYaka are very funny in how they, pray is not the right word, they demand share from Komba. And I remember one time, it's one of the very few times when I've heard people actually talk to Komba directly. And we'd been walking out in the forest, and we found some honey, but it was a particularly difficult tree. It was an area of forest that was normally flooded. So it had lots of very thorny lianas growing everywhere, making sort of just moving around quite awkward. And as we cut this tree, it proved to be quite resistant to our efforts. We couldn't climb it because of all these thorns everywhere, so we had to just cut it down. And the afternoon proceeded towards evening, and it was getting clear that we weren't going to get home to camp by nightfall, but we were so close to this tree coming down and all the honey that was in it being available to us that we persisted. And sunset's dead on 6 in the forest, we're on the equator. And at around 5 o'clock, finally the tree started creaking over, and it was about to fall when it got caught up in a whole bunch of these lianas that were running through the canopy there, and just stuck. And my friend Ngi, he shouted, "Hey, Komba, I'll like you today if you let this tree down so I can eat honey." And then, you know, after not very long, the tree and the weights just pulled the lianas and it came crashing down. And indeed it was full of lots of very delicious honey, and we feasted. We feasted until it was dark, actually. I remember the bees were very aggressive. It was quite difficult. And we had to walk back to camp in the pitch blackness, which was very tricky through this thick, thorny forest without torches. Made me realize how damaging electric light is to your night vision. It really is something that my night vision was so terrible. Okay, so I think I'll just go to my PowerPoint now and share that with you, because there'll be some images which will help to just help you see what's right here we are. Yes. So these hunter-gatherers are groups of people who can't make war. Indeed, they have huge difficulties resisting anyone who comes along aggressively claiming things of theirs. And they tend to just ignore it and avoid confrontation, moving away rather than addressing things. And so their communities really are very open and welcoming. They really, I mean, my dear friend Mongemba, who's crippled and a very wise man, he said to me, you know, you should share if you love people properly. And indeed, that really does sum up the way that the BaYaka treats anybody, strangers, lepers, people you might consider to be you know, needing to be pushed away in other societies. Here they're welcomed and incorporated without question. And so, you know, while fire in our evolution helps us shorten our intestines to digest food more efficiently, and our use of flint and tools and tool making turned us from scavengers into hunters, what really made us human was song and dance. And so I want to share part of this story with you today, how as we dance and sing our gods into existence, we can either let them dominate us, or in turn, we can become them. And I want to show how, or share how the BaYaka know their gods through a focus on Ijengi. And that's the spirit you can see just in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen here, dancing off back into the forest. Ijengi is the most powerful and ancient forest spirit. And those of you who heard me last week will remember that he's at the heart of how current society formed itself. Now, last week I discussed the fundamental role of blood in structuring the gender division of labor across human societies. And this extraordinary painting, a cave painting from Zimbabwe, describes this beautifully. The classic human ritual trope of the significance of women's blood, the blood of menstruation, and men's blood, the blood of hunting and killing animals, and the connections and disconnections between the two. They are what's established the gender division of labor that still persists in remnant forms in many societies today. So for instance, if you're a Catholic and menstruating, you can't go and get communion, or you shouldn't go and get communion from a priest. Jesus's blood cannot mix with your powerful blood. Quite widely around the world, if women are menstruating, they're seen to be so powerful that they mess up men's rituals. They cause them to be ineffective or have perverse actions. Just thinking practically, I mean, modern supermarkets and late capitalism have rather changed this, but those of you with longer memories will remember that it was extremely unusual for women to work in slaughterhouses or to be hunters indeed. Or even to work in butchers' shops, preparing meat for sale. Surgeons, very rare in the past that would be a female job, or warriors, killers, going out to fight in armies. So in certain ways, these traces of these ancient symbolic orders of humanity still come through to us today. And many anthropologists and sociologists following Emile Durkheim argue that ritual was what provoked the origin of society, because it's an activity that reliably produces a sense of us, a sense of us as a group, an overarching metaphor of we sharing this activity, sharing this place, and sharing values. And as Chris and I have explained in other work, is central to understanding how we became humans, with the qualities that we particularly appreciate: language, culture, and so on. Now, What's very interesting about the traits that I was describing last week of the hunter-gatherers is that they are distributed across the world, from Southeast Asia right through to Africa. And this distribution of social organization, or elements of social organization and environmental relations, is something that I think is a very important thing to consider carefully when trying to understand the origins of human beings and our ways of doing things. And also how these immediate return hunter-gatherers treat their gods. I want to just mention, or recap from last week, that the hunter-gatherers I'm going to be focusing on, these Central African hunter-gatherers, have been present in this forest for something between 74 and 50,000 years. So they really are old inhabitants of the forest. But what's fascinating is that the material solutions they've developed for living in this forest are sort of optimal adaptations. They are such effective uses of the things you find in that environment for making human life very pleasant and agreeable, that they are still shared by these communities, even though they live thousands of miles apart. They speak languages as far apart as English and Persian or other languages. They're really unrelated language groups, some of them. And they have slightly different rituals, but they certainly have some remarkable similarities that well, Morna and Camilla have both talked about in Rag at different points. And I mean, you can see the huts that are similar here, the way that men are more in the center of camp, women more around the huts, the hearth at each, well, in one case you've got a central hearth, which is what men have, and then you've got little hearths in each hut. But it really is, the similarities between these groups on the material level is really quite remarkable. And it extends to solutions like honey collecting equipment. And honey is, of course, something, as we discussed last week, at the heart of these societies. And what's very interesting is that these similarities are echoed by all sorts of practical similarities, like the emphasis on demand sharing, on refusing and rejecting leadership, on their sort of intense appreciation of mobility, that no one can tell anyone where to go, not even a parent to a child. So there's complete freedom of movement. There's no word for goodbye or I'll miss you or those kinds of things in their language. Rather than hang around to solve a problem you have with somebody else, you just avoid them. You don't need to hang around, just walk away, go somewhere else, go and see someone else. Every individual has free access to the key resources that they require for living and to learning the key skills that they need to make the basic tools and things they'll need for life. They have these gendered rituals where they call forest spirits into camp to play with people, and they all sing in this unique polyphonic style that's unique to pygmies and sand bushmen. And it's a very old tradition. As I said, people arrived in around 70,000 years ago. But what's fascinating is that the eastern and western hunter-gatherers of Central Africa separated some 27,000 years ago. So the Bambangeli and the Bambuti last shared a mother 27,000 years ago, according to the genetic studies. And this is to think about cultural continuity, not just in material culture, but also in this extraordinary, dense polyphonic singing style over such long periods of time, hints at something much bigger. And I call this a Central African hunter-gatherer civilization, which is different to the sorts of civilizations that we're used to, because rather than accept hierarchy and dominance as part and parcel of the class system or whatever it might be, royalty and so on, they reject hierarchy. And hierarchy, rather than being at the heart of their civilization, is pushed to the periphery. It's what those gorilla Bilo people do. It's what other white people do. It's not what we do. It's not the proper way of being human. And that, I think, or when I get towards the end, will come back to be significant. So I want to focus on this particular spirit, Ajengi, and there are lots of myths around Ajengi, but what I thought is that I just play you one little example of one of the myths, and this is a myth about chimpanzee, Sumbu. And chimpanzee is very greedy. He always wants everything for himself. He wants the girls, he wants the music, he wants the food, he wants everything for himself. And one day the people are dancing, they're doing an Ajengi initiation actually, and we're going to come back to that soon. And as the Ajengi is dancing and preparing to take the initiates into his sacred secret path, the chimpanzee comes running along, and he sits down, forcing himself among the young initiates waiting to be initiated, and he wants to be initiated. And the people are all panicked, because if Sumbu tries to get initiated, he'll get killed by Ajengi, because if you don't survive the ordeal, if you don't succeed in the ordeals that Ajengi will demand of you, then you'll die. And so the people are trying to tell chimpanzee, you're going to die, you mustn't do this. And the point of the story that I'm just going to play you briefly is at the point where the chimpanzee's sat down with the initiate, and the people are trying to tell him to get out, and he's protesting and screaming and screeching as chimpanzees do. And what's particularly interesting is that when BaYaka tell these myths, these stories, they're called likano, they all tell it together. So there may be one person who begins the telling, but then they drop off as they're drowned out by the singing voices of people reenacting that moment of initiation, when the boys are about to be taken onto the Njanga, the sacred path. And other people transform into chimpanzee and start emulating the sounds and mimicking the sounds and emulating the behavior of chimpanzee as he's sitting there trying to bully his way into getting initiated. And other people speaking in BaYaka, telling chimpanzee, come on, you're going to get killed, don't do this, it's madness. And so as you participate in this storytelling, it's something which is polyphonic in the sense that it's coming from every direction, different parts of the story are being enacted around you, and it becomes an immersive event. It's not a story being told in the way that we're familiar with. It's actually a story being relived, being re-experienced by the people who are participating. So I'll just quickly play this to you, and I'll have to check the volumes, right? Okay, and I'll just play. Here we are. So this is Sumbu Awe. Chimpanzee is going to die. Oh, come on. So that was a story. That wasn't a song. Anyway, just to give you a sort of a sense of what I was talking about. So the tradition I'm going to be talking about, and the myths indeed that you've just heard, is shared in this area. I call it the Makondi Economic Area, because all the pygmy groups that live in this area trade the rights, well, let's call it technologies of enchantment. And the technologies of enchantment, each one is one of these forest spirit performances, and each forest spirit has its own name. And I think that probably the easiest way of translating this briefly is that each of the names of those forest spirits reflect a different quality of joy that can be produced reliably among people who follow the ritual procedures associated with that forest spirit. And this is the most highly valued thing for these hunter-gatherers. There was a man who, for instance, he worked for a logging company for 3 months, and he'd earned some few hundred pounds. And rather than spend his money on a shotgun, which for a hunter would be the thing you might assume would be the most desirable thing, he spent it all on the right to perform one of these spirit plays. In Yomo, it was called, that particular one. And it was some, £300 that he spent. Really quite a substantial, the most expensive thing I've ever seen BaYaka spend money on. And so anyway, these are really important cultural institutions for the BaYaka. So Ijengi is common to Aka, Baka, BaYaka, Mbengele, Mikaya, Luma, and many other of the Western Pygmy groups. And I suspect is probably one of the really ancient forest spirits. And he's widely considered the most powerful forest spirit. And the ritual symbolism that's associated with the initiation ceremonies really does go right back to the beginning of society. And in particular, initiation into the Ijengi secret society replays the ancient drama at the heart of relations between men and women, and recounts how society emerged. Now, last week I discussed briefly the creation myth, so I'm not going to go into detail on it today, but suffice to say that, and that's of course why chimpanzee can't be initiated, because he's not human, he's not part of society. So the creation myth is really a story about Komba. Komba is the creator, and he makes men and women on separate parts of the forest, doesn't tell them about each other. Men screw these hard forest fruit called mapumbe to relieve themselves, and women dance Ijengi, and little girls baby girls fall from the leaves of Ijengi. Each gender group could survive independently of the other because they had no economic dependency. So women fished, collected wild yams, insects and fruit and so on. Men hunted elephants, wild boar, collected honey and dug wild yams and collected fruit and insects and so on. So each gender is autonomous economically from the other. And that, of course, is very important for the power of men and women together. So this myth, though it's a story, has political significance because it reminds each of the gender groups that they're not dependent on the other group. It also reminds each individual that they're not dependent on any other person, because they can satisfy all their elementary needs by themselves. And this elementary autonomy is crucial for men and women to maintain their autonomy while resisting attempts by the others at coercion or pressure. So in effect, it's a sort of ideological, and the myth is an ideological as well as a material bedrock that makes avoidance strategy, not needing to deal with or confront problems, but you can simply leave them because you haven't got anything to lose. There's nothing anyone can hold against you or use to pull you back, that you'll lose your job, you need the money or whatever it is. Men and women's groups each control their own distinctive repertoire of forest spirits. They're all these different Mokondi Masana. And when doing this forest spirit work, men and women form themselves into these original same-sex groups of the first people when they retreat to the privacy and secrecy of what's called the Njanga, the sacred paths of each spirit. So every permanent campsite has an Ijengi. I'll talk about Ijengi, but every forest spirit has its own Njanga. Every permanent campsite has its own Njanga path, and it's clearly marked with large palm fronds or branches to warn the uninitiated not to enter. And it's here that men meet to discuss their most private and sacred preoccupations. And there's a code of conduct that the Bangonja are expected to follow when they're on this path. Discussions should be melodic, unhurried, and accompanied by theatrical and comical reenactments of recounted events. And for those of you who know about Mwajo and the reenactments that women do of bad behavior in camp, the Njanga is where men do their Mwajo, and their Mwajo is all about hunting. It's all about sharing in a safe environment the secrets that allow men to become effective hunters of these extraordinarily large, dangerous animals that elephants and buffalo and wild boar that they specialize in hunting. They also discuss all the elements around preparing these rituals so that women won't hear and that they can maintain their monopolistic control of the ritual. And similarly, why they hide their hunting Mwajo here is because they don't want women to learn how to hunt. So women keep having to come back to us for meat because women do love meat. Anything that's summoned out of camp by the ritual. So one of the things that these rituals do is they produce stuff. They manage to extract hidden things from people through a number of different techniques, which I don't have time to describe here. But this feasting and production of stuff to enjoy, you know, tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, food of all descriptions, honey, you know, these are considered to be the fruits of ritual. So my Benjele friends laugh at the farmers when they're doing their rituals, where they pour libation to the ancestors and they ask for fertility and may the crops be good this year and the fields fertile and so on. And they laugh and say, look, that's empty ritual. They're just pretending. You know, the crops will be good. They're good every year. It's just them making themselves the center of attention. When we do ritual, we get stuff right now, here and now, and we consume and we feast. And indeed, Ijengi is the most effective at producing lots and lots of things. And indeed, Ijengi is only called when it is possible to do this, to have lots of stuff. So the Ijengi initiation is the only way to be incorporated into this exclusive group that reconnects to the first men, and the connection provides initiates with special abilities. So Ijengi hones your forest skills. You are able to see with Ijengi's eyes. You can see the path. You can escape from charging animals. You can quickly move from one place to another. And the initiated men elaborate an ideology of masculinity and male values on the Njanga, and these include acting as a unified group, their solidarity, respecting Ijengi's secrets, not sharing them with the uninitiated, and not complaining about hardship or suffering, speaking honestly and boldly without fear of the consequences. There's a certain robustness, that a stoicism that men are expected to have. Initiation incorporates the neophyte, the Mboni, into this male group and connects them with their mythic past and the values of the original Mensis group. The public aspects of initiation illustrate parts of how this happens. Initiations often occur for a number of boys together, and you can probably see my son being initiated here, but rarely more than 3 or 4. The neophyte sponsor from among the initiates is referred to as his Ijengi father, and it's his role to ensure that the neophyte understands the trials he'll face and that he breaks none of the prohibitions imposed on him during the initiation period. He mustn't eat any food prepared by women. He mustn't talk or touch women. He can only wear the traditional loincloths and must remain barefoot at all times. From that moment on until the end of the initiation, he must sleep in the forest away from the women. He mustn't wash until his ordeals are over, and then it's Ijengi that must wash him. So the process begins with the women beautifying the boys, and although they don't have ochre in the forest, they do have mongole, which is the bark of a very red tree. And the boys are all painted red, and then they're dotted with the white lime and ash to give further beauty to them. And they then are sat on a mat in the hot sun while the whole community dances around them, giving them strength to confront the ordeals that they're going to be facing as soon as Ijengi takes them off. And as more and more, so the way it begins is that the guardian of Ijengi will demand goods from the families of these boys. And as these goods arrive on the Njanga and the initiates and Ijengi consume them, when they achieve a certain satisfaction, then they begin to dance Ijengi around, and the men come out and dance around the boys, and the women join them, and eventually Ijengi comes out and starts dancing with them too. And often after about 3 or 4 hours, the children who are expected to sit, like the one boy is on the extreme right of the image with his head down on his arms. The other boys have become too curious and want to see what Ijengi is up to. Anyway, so they sit there for several hours in the fierce heat, feeling the pressure of the anticipation for what's going to happen. And as time passes, they're shifted from to face each of the cardinal points until finally they're shifted towards facing the Njanga, and then at a certain point, woof, Ijengi takes them, and they rush off to the Njanga, and their ordeals begin. And I won't go into all the details of the ordeals, but I'll just mention some of them. Sometime later, while the women are still assembled together outside the Njanga, and the women, relatives of the boys, will be performing particular dances and singing certain songs that will give power to the boys so they survive the ordeals. And then suddenly, out of the forest, the mapombe start flying, those large forest fruit that men used to screw, start flying out of the undergrowth towards the women. And if one of them should hit the women, it's said that she's going to die. So the women, of course, flee into their huts, closing up their entrances. And shortly afterwards, the men charge out of the Njanga with fresh stems of a large leaf called the ngongo, marron tassé, extraordinary plant actually. And they come and they beat, they're about 1.5 meters long, and they beat the huts that the women are hiding in. And if they find women's things like pots or whatever, cooking pots, they'll tip them over, and they'll just generally, terrorize and make a lot of noise and be very fierce. And the women, of course, stay hidden away, and then after a couple of minutes, the men return to the Njanga path. The neophytes, the Mboni, they remain on the Njanga path for 3 days. The only times they come out will be after this, after the ordeals are complete, when Ijengi starts to dance in the community. And while they're on the path for this 3 days, there's lots of secret instruction that takes place. And the instruction is punctuated by Ijengi dancing at all times of night and day. So it really is a 3-day ritual, and people don't have a notion of 8 hours sleep. You dance and dance until you're exhausted, then everyone just crashes out for a couple of hours, and then you pick up again and off you go again. So the singing, the rhythm is often you dance until around 4 in the morning, then people sleep, or 2 in the morning, and then people sleep for a couple of hours. 4 in the morning again, they start dancing until around midday, and then people sleep for a few hours, and then they start dancing again in the afternoon, and then they sleep for another hour or 2, and then they'll dance in the evening and night again. But around midday on the 3rd day, the neophytes emerge for the last time from the Njanga path. And this time, rather than just being with themselves, they are actually holding and dragging Ijengi by his leaves into the camp. And they drag Ijengi with them and start dancing and singing. And then after some time of parading around the camp, they reverse, and Ijengi then leads them down to the water and washes them in the water to wash off the dirt of the initiation, and to reinstate them now as initiates, as full men. So the initiation ceremony publicly emphasizes the way the men's group has changed since the mythic past. All the key characters of the myth are present: the men's group, the women's group, Ijengi and the Mapombe. But the ceremony shows them in a new relationship to each other. The women who've given birth to the boy beautify and prepare him for the initiation. They voluntarily give him up to Ijengi and the initiates. Through their actions, he's given courage and protection during his ordeals. When the men throw the mapombe fruit at the women, they're reminding the women of Ijengi's complex reproductive potency and also reiterating their mythical rejection of the mapombe fruit and their preference for women. They remind all of their physical strength and the strength they used to demand and take Ijengi from the women, and their control of the sperm that women now require to become pregnant and to procreate. The attack on women and their things is intended to reinforce the message that women must respect the men, since that original strength which they took Ijengi remains present. This strength can appear aggressive and frightening to non-Mbengele observers, but its effect on the women is more complex. On the one hand, they might well feel intimidated by the men's show of strength, but because these are their fathers, their brothers, their husbands and lovers, the strength is theirs, ready to protect them from the dangerous wild animals of the forest. So while the men's show of strength is intimidating, it's also comforting and playful. And initiation is incorporation into this exclusive and powerful social group, responsible for providing game meat and honey to the women, both extremely dangerous activities. The trials that are set of the neophyte are focused on developing their skill and confidence in the forest. In many obvious and hidden ways, Ijengi ensures that boys become Mbengele men. As they pass time on the Njanga path, new initiates learn from the reenactments of great hunting moments about the behaviors of dangerous animals as they are killed, and the strategies that men have found to do so more swiftly and safely. They hear about hunting, honey collecting, and Ijengi's secrets. These recitals are unique to the Njanga path and provide boys with informal instruction and important techniques that will facilitate a successful forest life. Through the skills they learn, the secrets they're told, and the values these instill, they are, at least in theory, capable of everything that will be required of them. Despite this control of Ijengi by the men, if Ijengi is to come out into the camp and give joy to all with his dance, then he must be seduced out of the Njanga by the beautiful singing and sexy dancing of the women. The relationship is complex. The women love Ijengi and love to lure him into the public space to dance with them, but they also fear him, since the men changed his magic, so instead of giving them babies, touching Ijengi's clothing will cause them to menstruate continuously and potentially bleed to death. This combination of desire and fear is an important ingredient that helps participants keep up the energy for the minimum 3 days that an Ijengi spirit play must dance. So Ijengi ritual juxtaposes the original men's group with the original women's group by making both mythically present on the ritual stage, as well as present in the interacting gendered bodies of men and women in the masana. In this way, each member of the group is regularly reminded of the origin of sociality and the social contract between men and women that has enabled them to live together since they first met. By dancing Ijengi, elements of the mythical time of single-sex groups are experienced at the same time as the new or current relationship between the gender groups. So myth becomes a lived experience, and in the performance, time collapses into an ancient, eternal present, just as the Australians call it, that everywhen. Maybe because of his role in forming society as it is lived together, Ijengi plays a crucial role in healing and reforming society after the major social rupture of death. Ijengi is crucial to the lifting of mourning or commemoration ceremonies of every ethnic group in the region, hunter-gatherer or not. To begin calling Ijengi into the public space, the initiated men form a line with the drummers, and this line acts as a barrier to protect the uninitiated men, women and children from the dancing Ijengi, and you can see it in this picture. Initiated men take turns beating the long mokinda drum, beating out the bass line, and the shorter double-sided ndumu drum, which dances between and around the main rhythm. The drums are all that remain stationary once Ijengi comes out to dance. When the singing is beautiful enough, Ijengi emerges from the Njanga path, swirling and twirling, rising up very tall, then suddenly becoming very small, crouching for a few moments before continuing his swirling, cascading motion towards the line of initiates. Their bodies act as a barrier that prevents Ijengi from getting to the uninitiated behind them. Sometimes Ijengi breaks through the barrier, scattering the uninitiated as they flee. The danger intrinsic to the dance produces a heightened sensory awareness. In conjunction with music, physical exertion, and sleep deprivation, it facilitates the sort of exuberant trance states that people enter as the dance proceeds. For the women, the tension between fleeing Ijengi and then attracting him back in again by beautiful singing and sexy dancing charges the atmosphere and reminds them that he was once their penis. As the performance progresses through its phases, some women become increasingly aroused. Men sometimes discuss the way Ijengi dances as explicitly mirroring aspects of coitus. One man described it to me thus: "He begins small and slow, but as the women's throats open, i.e. as they sing more beautifully, and they dance, he gets harder, taller, more energetic and faster. Then when he's pushing up high and spinning, it's just like your semen going into a woman. When Ijengi gets small again to rest, he's just like a penis. When Ijengi sits and rests near the women, it's like the way we show a woman we want to marry her. After making love, we stay, sitting next to her in her hut, and we stay with her even after sex." In other words, demonstrating it's not just a casual relationship. So, with their bottoms jiggling forwards, women lure Ijengi out of the forest and into camp. Their seductiveness and arousal plays an important role in maintaining the sexual dynamics that animate this spirit play. Their dancing is intended to look irresistible to both the men and to Ijengi. When men got Ijengi from the women, they changed his magic so as to overdose women with fertility, and that would lead them to keep bleeding and menstruating. So women really are terrified of being touched by Ijengi when he dances. This danger really arouses an energy, a sort of heightened sensory awareness that really facilitates the trance states people enter during this 3-day dance. And the fear Ijengi creates is a source of pride for men. Men should be feared since they protect the women from potentially deadly animals and strange people. To tempt Ijengi into camp, women may break through the gaps and go past the line of initiates, dancing out, following Ijengi. The women sexually lure Ijengi back with their provocative bottom wiggling dance. As they dance, the women advance sideways, curving their necks down away from the direction of motion, giving the impression that their wiggling bottoms are leading them forwards. Men say and Benjelin men say they love women's bottom. As one man explained, "Men only see women's bottoms, that's what they're after." A woman's bottom wiggling quickly makes many Benjelin men or an Ijengi become consumed with lust. Other women will pass beyond the initiate's line and dance forward, provocatively taunting Ijengi, until he begins to move into camp and towards the women. As he does, they rush back to safety behind the drums and the initiated men. Ijengi compels people to share not only in the practical sense, but to share social power. Initially epitomizing the raw power of male force, Ijengi is cooked by the irresistible eros of women. The spirit now twirls, growing taller, then suddenly small again in response to the women's singing. The cascading singing style of the women during the climactic phases of an Ijengi dance session is the sonic mimesis of the way the raffia leaves cascade down during Ijengi's spinning dance. This is often the section of the performance in which women become most sexually excited, as if remembering when they used to dance Ijengi themselves. And sometimes when they get particularly wild, they can dance up behind the initiates, sometimes rubbing their body against the initiate's back. And it's important to point out that the men cannot turn around, or they shouldn't turn around to look at who is doing this to them. They're just expected to remain stoic and concerned with protecting from Ijengi. Sometimes they stretch both hands between a man's legs to rub them down the length of his penis. And this penis grabbing tends to happen mostly to young single men, and the sexual innuendo is a major source of energy that can fuel the dance for several days. Such behaviors add a sort of erotic spark to proceedings that really is important when you're dancing for such extended periods, and it greatly enhances the enthusiasm and the dynamism of performance. And the role of younger people, of teenagers and young adults in animating these dances for these extended periods is vital. And I think that part of that sexual dynamic is very important to keep them going for these periods. Women flee when Ijengi breaks through or tries to break through the line of men. And this is the climactic stage of a session of Ijengi. And when done properly, creates an extraordinarily exuberant, risky, wild, joyful atmosphere, tinged with fear, eroticism, and sexual bravado. While women haven't elaborated to me verbally on the subject, their behavior suggests that the symbolic intentions of the men are effective. Men are explicit about Ijengi's phallic symbolism during this part of the dance. These sections are characterized by the spirit rising up from around 1 meter tall to extend up to 2 meters high as the long raffia leaves swirl beautifully down the length of the spirit. The symbolism of semen tumbling down the phallus is explicit and recognized. Men say that this is why women go so wild during this phase of performance. Ijengi Masana combines the men's and women's groups together in ways that emphasize their uniqueness and difference in order to achieve a remarkably synchronized and synergistic whole. Women's sexy dancing lures Ijengi into the public space. Ijengi's sexual symbolism excites them to dance even more, and the initiate's strength and mastery of the danger to women protects, comforts, and drives them to sing and dance even better. In combination, they manage to bring Ijengi out of the forest and safely into the human group, so all can share in this special joy. So Ijengi celebrates men's unique abilities, skills, and powers in the forest and their intimate relationship with the forest creatures. By depending on the women and children to sing and entice Ijengi into the human group, the men emphasize that women and children are complementary to this power. Their respective roles could be paralleled with those of hunting and cooking. Men bring in the raw meat, women cook it and enable all to gain energy from it. When men are with Ijengi, he's raw in the forest or on the Njanga. Women's dancing cooks him, getting him hotter and hotter so he can come into the public space so that the joy this brings can be enjoyed by all. Ijengi is one of the most dangerous and powerful forest spirits that men can summon and control. And so he expresses their mastery of and skill within this forest environment. Ijengi has far-reaching implications from Benjeli men's relations with all the significant beings they interact with, be they animals and Benjeli women and children, or their neighboring farming Bilo neighbors. So Ijengi is a realm in which male identity is elaborated, expressed, and recreated for each generation. The emphasis of the Ijengi ritual association is on developing male power in opposition to women. The source of this power is in the forest and forest activities. Ijengi provides his initiates with social, economic, and religious power. The social power is from the solidarity achieved between men, the coordinated support they offer each other during the performance, and the way they control and handle Ijengi as he dances wildly. In relation to women, the ritual association expresses their ignorance of male power and how men control the dangerous beasts of the forest. By participating in the ritual, they structurally accept their acceptance and their support that men should obtain these social products from these dangerous creatures and give them to them. Women show their support for this division of labor and the respect for Ijengi and the men by their crucial role in calling Ijengi into the human group with their beautiful singing and seductive dancing. Ijengi's power is strong and both feared and loved by the women. And that creates this unique quality of joy, of tension, of challenge and excitement that Ijengi brings. The religious power comes from Ijengi's crucial role in establishing society in the creation myth. And this makes him the most important forest spirit, symbolizing the social contract that enabled men and women to live together, to make love and to bear children. By reliving the key elements of the myth in the initiation and spirit play, participants experience their cosmology not as an ideology, but as a meaningful physical experience in their lives. By collapsing time, melting the present with the mythical past, through Ijengi, the living come to embody their ancestors and their most sacred gods. Not like the gift of fire, a demigod as Prometheus, who stole it from Zeus, came and gave it to humanity, but as humanity in control of its own destiny, fashioning it in an ancient pact between men and women. Still today, Ijengi is the most important forest spirit, not just for the BaYaka, but for all their neighbors. Every time someone dies, it is Ijengi that anybody in the forest has to call to clean up after the rupture of death, to remove the pollution of death from the bereaved, and to reinstate society again after that rupture. It really is quite remarkable. And while the fear and deliberate aggression that men use in Ijengi could lead to a superficial understanding of Ijengi as an assertion of male dominance, the mythical claims men make to have taken him from women could also be seen in this way. And during an Ijengi Masana, men will appear to dominate the community, demanding complete obedience from the uninitiated. But the dominance men exert during Ijengi Masana might be better understood as their dominance of Ijengi. It doesn't extend beyond Ijengi, it is context dependent. During the Masana of Bolu, which is for children, the children dominate the community, though much less effectively than the men during Ijengi. And as you will have seen from other talks I've given and the talks that Morna has given, during women's Masana, such as in Goku, women dominate the community. So although at times during Ijengi, men may elaborate ideas about male superiority, these claims are not tolerated outside the context of Ijengi. Rather than legitimacy, this gives the claims a performative value, giving them a playful or game-like quality. And this is important because it provides women with the opportunity to cultivate their skill and ability to resist and undermine male claims. And for this reason, they're tolerated by the women and accepted during the Ijengi Masana. Learning as protagonists of their own origin myth to playfully disarm each other, so these hunter-gatherers have effectively disarmed God. This may seem unrelated, but as a postdoc student of mine, Adrian Poole, he did a very interesting comparison of the rhythmic structures used in San Bushman and Pygmy music. And what he did was a sort of statistical comparison that constructed a phylogenetic tree of the rhythmic relations between these different songs. And what's particularly surprising, there's a lot that we could talk about here, but what I just want to point out is that of all the rhythms that he analyzed, Ijengi rhythms came out as the oldest rhythms. And this now touches on something which is increasingly intriguing to me, and an area which I've been looking at more and more with more and more fascination, is that this god, which is probably unfamiliar to most of you, is actually the most popular, the most enduring, and perhaps the oldest god of humanity. He's called Bes, and he's the most ancient of all the known and named gods across time and civilizations. He's considered the god of song and dance, of sex, childbirth and fertility, of children and women, of laughter and merriment, and the protector from wild animals and snakes for at least the last 6,000 years. And I'm starting to uncover more evidence that perhaps even older. He's said to have his origins in the pre-Egyptian Nubian civilization, where it's quite possible that there were ancient contacts between Central African hunter-gatherers and these early Nubians. The first recorded contacts between ancient Egyptians and Central African hunter-gatherers are found on a tablet dating to 5,000 years ago. And Pharaoh Cheops II was a child pharaoh. He was 12 when he came to power. And he was very curious about his kingdom. And so he sent his captains to every corner and every extreme. And one of them went to discover the origins, the source of the Nile. And the source of the Nile is currently in sort of southwestern Uganda, in an area that still today is populated by Central African former hunter-gatherers, as they've been kicked out of all the forests by farmers and by conservationists. And when he sent his captain out, the captain sent a tablet back to Alexandria or wherever Cheops was, and saying that he'd found the dancers of God in the land of tall trees. And Cheops was so intrigued by this description that he sent his own galley to go and collect the dancers of God to bring them back to ancient Egypt. And I mean, it's difficult. I need to do more research into this, but there's a very important tradition among the elites of ancient Egypt that whenever they held a big feast, at the end of the feast, they asked a lot of, they had to have dwarfs, or perhaps pygmies, who would finish the feast by dancing. And these dwarf dancers were absolutely central to making sure that you were showing you were a proper, important person. But Bes's tradition, Bes in ancient Egypt was actually the most popular deity, and it was perhaps because he didn't require any priestly intervention. You know, the high gods of Egypt, those ones that you'd always see in profile, very different iconography to Bes that you can see here. They would require the high priests to interact with them, whereas Bes, anybody could. And so, you know, little amulets and the pillars of ordinary people's houses would be carved with figures of Bes. Bes was really found right through from the ancient empires up to the more recent ones, and indeed right across the Mediterranean basin. Whoops. And some 6,000 years later, Bes is still worshipped, and Ibiza, as you may know, an island famous for dance, revelry, merriment, sex, and lots of fun, is the island of Bes. That is what Ibiza means. And you can still, if you're a tourist, as you can see on the bottom right of this slide, buy in tourist shops little trinkets, little icons of Bes to take home. And notice that on the trinket's chest, you have this little skull. And this same skull from 6,000 years ago on this dendron sculpture is present. And that actually is one of the characteristics. There's a Yoruba god who has the same physical appearance. Anyway, these are things I'm still exploring, but fascinating. So these, what's extraordinary is how fascinating these Central African hunter-gatherers have been to outsiders from every major civilization of the Mediterranean basin. And while these hierarchically structured civilizations of the past have been fascinated by them, they've come and gone, while this Central African civilization has endured until today. And in a sense, you know, if we take the perspective of the BaYaka or these early pygmies, you know, maybe it was them coming to inspect these other civilizations, which was actually going on in these interactions between them and the ancient Egyptians and others, that they were coming to have a look and curious to see, you know, well, what are these little young spring chickens doing? And of course, even ancient Egypt does seem like a youthful civilization compared to what we have in Central Africa, or a short-lived civilization. And so the resilience of this Central African civilization, I think, can be traced through their music and ritual powers. Still today, Central African hunter-gatherers play a central role in all the most important rituals of their neighbors, from enthroning chiefs to ritually reconstituting society after the rupture of death, or ensuring fertility, curing the sick, and protecting newcomers as they move into the forest by guiding them safely. So I hope that I've made clear how, by dancing their creation myth, each generation is able to enter into their mythical narratives as actors and participants, reaffirming the agreements upon which human society is based. In effect, they have become, or through these practices, they become their own gods, where sacredness is an emergent phenomenon of ritual collaboration. It's the collective act of dancing and singing together in certain ways that creates a space of joyful exuberance where self dissolves into the acoustic and physical mass of participants to experience something beyond emotion, beyond the ordinary, something deeply connecting, an expansive awareness that's accompanied by a deep joy and a deep connection to your past and your future. Okay, well, there we are.
Well, so follow that, somebody.
So I'm trying to get rid of my...
All right, I can see your face and your,
okay, good, right.
And your PowerPoint seems to have gone.
Good. All right, well, that's the main thing. Yeah, so there we are. That's some. There's something that I've been very interested in trying to sort of explore in more detail. And because the Ngoku film stuff is always so powerful, it tends to sort of.
Well, I'm going to argue back.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that, Camilla. There was some.
Camilla, you're disappearing.
Maybe can you hear me? Okay, somebody else talk while my.
No. You've suddenly got good again. You have got
sure?
good again.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay, so tell me if you can't hear me. So that was fantastic. Really thought that was such a wonderful presentation of Ejengi. I mean, I have read a lot from your thesis, but that was so great to hear all that. But I was going to talk about this aspect of dominance, reverse dominance, because the everywhen that you're talking about, which can be described by African hunter-gatherers as first creation, very often happens with women's initiation. With the Hadza, it's definitely really Maitoko, where the women are asserting that they're going back to become the owners of Epime in some way. So we have this pattern of women asserting they used to own Ejengi, they used to own Epime, they used to own Molimo with the Mbuti, and then first creation, which happens, the visiting first creation comes out of the girl's first menstruation ceremony, very significantly. So in all this pattern, we have women changing, acting male or acting as animals and bleeding, and the aspect of reverse dominance in their claims to be the original owners. And I'd also say something about that, the painting, the rock painting from Zimbabwe you showed, which is very likely to be a reference to girls' first menstruation with the link of the girl's blood to the animals. The underlying layer is red ochre, and stupid thing that Peter Garlick does is he cuts off the moon. There's a moon there, which he cuts off in the image, which is really stupid. And then the black that's superimposed, the black painting, which maybe we don't know if it's the same time or a different time, has men, including men, nosebleeding. So what I'm getting to is, are men when they are leading the initiation to the revisitation to everyone, as in Ejengi, for instance, what happens with epime is the men do a kind of reverse gender characteristic. They become feminized in certain ways. They bleed also. So maybe it's a secret that you can't reveal, but I would expect that in Ejengi, there must be some process by which men in these ordeals have to bleed.
Well, yeah, as usual, Camilla, you are very perceptive. One of the, so, I mean, the point just before the men throw the mapumbe out, what they actually do, I didn't go into all the details because, you know, we don't have
Sure, you can't.
Yeah, but what they actually, so, you know, Ejengi kills the boys when they come onto the Njanga.
Yeah.
And, you know, the way that men show this is that they come out with the spear with the boy's blood on it.
Okay. The boy's blood. Oh, right. Okay.
The Ejengi has killed them. And they bring this spear out, and the women have to look after the spear while the other ordeals carry on. And they have to use, they can't touch it, but they can use leaves to keep the flies off the blood. And they have to keep the flies off the blood until the ordeals are complete. Okay. So yes, they do bleed, but in private. And yeah, and the blood is there, as you rightly point out. I mean, I think that you know, that what is very interesting is that I haven't come across any first menstrual rituals among Benjele, and you know, that's just the way it is. What they tend to so I've just been greeted by my dog. What they tend to do is, you know, is remain quite quiet about it. It's not something which is spoken about. So you know, the camp can't move. You just have to stay there for at least 4 or 5 days when it happens. And as I think some of you probably may be aware from reading my work, you know, it's just mum taking the girl off, or an auntie or someone, and explaining to her how to look after this blood, because it's so sought after by these nasty spirits that everyone wants to avoid. And so, you know, you hide it, you never wash it off and wash it away. You swipe it off with leaves, and then you put those leaves in the dense undergrowth so the spirits can find it, but people won't. And in that way you appease those nasty spirits without risking. So, I mean, it would be interesting. It's funny, I mean, there are boys' circumcision rituals among the BaYaka in Cameroon, but among the BaYaka, I mean, there are circumcisions, but it's not a big deal. It's just
have the circumcisions come from farmers?
Well, it's interesting. So hunter-gatherers in general are the bloodletters for farmers. So they will often do bloodletting activities. And they do the circumcisions for the farmers, which I was amazed how the farmers they trust their young boys.
Take the risk.
And sometimes, you know, you get some really nasty scenarios. I've seen some terrible things where hunter-gatherers take it out on those little boys. Yeah, very unpleasant. But so anyway, so yeah, it is surprising, and I do think it's probably borrowed from the farmers. And certainly where the BaYaka do it, it follows exactly a particular farmer's ritual. But at the same time, the Benjele all are circumcised. You know, it really is, you know, a basic thing that men should be.
Just to say that with the, I mean, that pattern of not that much fuss of girls' first menstruation, but there is a big women's initiation. Yeah. That is also the pattern with the Hadza to some extent. So the two things are kind of linked in. It's a sort of sequence.
I mean, maybe there's also a practical element to it that, you know, to organize one of those big rituals, you want a lot of girls together.
Yeah, exactly. It's about the collectivity, is a personal ritual collectivity. I think that's it. And anyway, Akila is such a habituated practice that it's kind of, instead of being a big ritual, it's like there all the time.
Covered already, yeah.
Well, is there a sense in which Ngoku, when it does happen, is kind of the big ritual that the girls will be involved with, and particularly involved with knowledge, thanks to the fact they have gone through that rather sort of low-key, you know, transition to being a woman through, you know, I mean, in other words, there's not much fuss made about first menstruation, but when when that girl is involved in the Goku, is that sort of the big one for her, rather as Camilla's been describing with.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that's peculiar is that, you know, I don't know if you saw the age of those boys being initiated, but they were 7 years old.
Yeah.
And it's similar with girls. You know, they get initiated into Ngoku. I mean, you know, I've not looked at this in any detail, but I would presume before they start menstruating. So there is a sort of, you know, you learn about the power of your body before your body starts to exhibit that power, in a sense with the Benjele. There was something else I wanted to say about that. What was it? Yeah, and I mean, the other side, I guess, is that, you know, what the Benjele women always love to emphasize is, look, we gave the men a Jengi. Do you understand? Obviously, what we kept is much more powerful.
Yeah.
And they have this sort of maternal way of patting you on the shoulder and saying, okay, you know, you enjoy what you've got, that's fine, but no, we have more. And certainly, and so there's Yele as well, which is the big women's ritual, which is not described so much in the literature, which one day I should get to properly describing, because this is where women catch the animals that men hunt. And it's a very important way that women actually, so when we go elephant hunting, men say, oh, we're going on a women's hunt. And, you know, at first I was puzzled, what do you mean you're going on a women's hunt? Well, the women have already caught the elephant, we're just going to finish it off. And there's a verb for the person who first thrusts the spear into an animal, mokobye. And so the women have mokobye the elephant, and men just go and finish it off. They do the easy bit, according to the anthropology.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the men don't really want the women to hunt, because otherwise the women wouldn't be dependent on them, and men wouldn't get the sex they rather urgently require.
Yeah.
But of course that's not the whole story, is it? I mean, the women, if the women were involved in bloodshedding type of hunting, there would be obviously the terrible threat to the solidarity between all the women, in view of the fact that some women would be able to do that, and you know, and others for whatever reasons wouldn't. It would just be divisive for the women. So I'm just anxious that people don't get the idea that women aren't allowed to hunt. That's the end of the story. That's why they don't.
I know women hunt in Benjele BaYaka society. Women will hunt. You know, look, if an antelope runs out into the path and there happens to be a woman walking along, she's not going to just say, "Oh, nice antelope, off it goes." You know, she'll grab it as best she can, and you know, what it is, it's how women kill. So women will not kill by piercing. They will not kill by bloodletting. What they'll do is they'll bludgeon, or they'll use the back of their machete to wallop the animal on the back of the head, or they'll grab it by the back legs and swing it against a tree to knock it out. You know, they just won't, this idea of piercing, of causing blood to flow, that's what women will not do at all. So, you know, it's not correct to say women net hunting, for instance, which I haven't participated in that often, but when I have, you know, if an animal comes to a bit of net where a woman is, she won't hesitate. You know, there's no, oh, come on, men, go and sort this out. No, she gets on with it. She won't muck around.
Thank you for clarifying that. Right, there's lots of people who haven't said anything. I hope everyone, I hope you all aren't sort of coercively muted. I hope you can all unmute yourself if you want to. Am I right there?
Yeah.
Or any hands up asking, anyone wanting to ask a question?
I might ask a question.
Okay.
Hi. Although this week also I have so many tangents I can't choose. I don't know. I was wondering about a few things, and it's really interesting what you just said about how women kill and how it differs. And I also really like the point about reenacting primal social relations. I'm thinking about, you know, just going to temple, what that looks like. I'm thinking about it in those terms, and I'm seeing, you know, all sorts of similarities, which is really interesting. There's something that sustains there, that is sustained. So I have a few separate thoughts. Regarding circumcision, I don't even have a question. I mean, I was so surprised to find that so many people around the world are practicing circumcision. So I don't know if you can say anything more about that, but I was really surprised to read that Emichele are practicing that as well. So I don't know if you can expand about that. I'm just curious. There's also the question of, you know, the fact that all these Central African hunter-gatherers share the same technologies and the same rituals, but they don't share the same language. I know it's been discussed a lot, but it's really mystifying. And I wonder what that tells us about language, basically, that these things are preserved, but language isn't, as if it's something more to do with external relations, with relations between groups, between cultures, or something like that. And finally, I was wondering about spirit plays. How far did they scale up? I was wondering if you could maybe tell us about the spirit plays in which there are the most participants. What kind of occasions are that? And I was also wondering, because I sort of understand that so you have different ejengis, right? Different people have different ejengis, and you have a camp and you're dancing ejengi. Who decides on whose ejengi comes up? So I was just wondering about that as well. So as you can see, all sorts of directions, so I'll just let you address whatever you want.
As always, Dor, they're excellent questions. Thank you. Just a sec, I just want to take notes so I don't... Okay, well, look, the question on circumcision, I mean, I can speculate, but I suspect that Chris probably has some more reflected answers, or maybe Camilla too, on that. But it is extraordinary that men should cut themselves so intimately and painfully in so many different cultures. It is quite a striking thing, and I'll leave that to them to answer. So sorry, I'm copping out on that one, because your other questions are excellent, and I've got plenty to say on that. So let me go forward. Yeah, so they share all these things, this ritual structures. They share these extraordinarily similar material culture. I mean, it really is just like, if I walk into a BaYaka camp, it's just like I'm walking into a Benjeli camp or a Luma camp or another camp, but not language. So why? And this is an excellent question, and it's one which has animated a lot of the earlier work I did. So for me, essentially, so, you know, if you think about, let's say, Europeans, the French and the British, who love to hate one another, but actually, you know, they're so similar. It really is quite remarkable. And you know, their lifestyles, I mean, Britain is actually Bretagne, and of course, Grande Bretagne is just Big Brittany, which is a part of France, of course. And so, in such a context, language becomes a really important way of creating a sense of autonomy and independence. And I think Norman the Conqueror decided to speak English and not introduce French, because he wanted to make sure he would not be bound to the court in Brittany that he had left. And so language in that context becomes a marker of distinctiveness when there is very few opportunities for marking that distinctiveness. And of course, you know, in the Middle East, the different languages, again, where people actually live the same way. I've got a student currently doing a study of hummus, and she's in all sorts of, you know, what's the history of hummus? Whose was it first? And, you know, and of course, it's not really possible to do that. And so when you're eating the same foods, you're farming the same crops, you're living in the same landscape, language suddenly becomes the thing people hook on to mark their distinctiveness. And that for me is perhaps why people in these situations where they're pretty much the same focus on language to really mark themselves as distinctive. When you're a hunter-gatherer living in a non-hierarchical egalitarian system, all those communities around you with their, to a hunter-gatherer, you know, senseless hierarchies, you know, there's no basis whatsoever for those elders to claim being smart and intelligent and having more access to religious or ritual power than other people. It's ludicrous. There's no basis for that, or why this patriarch should be able to determine where a woman lives or where his children farm. These sorts of impositions to them are just astounding, you know, that anyone could agree to that kind of control. So the differences between them and their neighbors are just so stark and radical that there isn't a need for these linguistic markers. And indeed, BaYaka people speak an Ubangian language. Now, the BaYaka live in Cameroon to the west of the Bambengele. They speak languages that are as closely related as English is to Persian, actually. The BaYaka speak this Ubangian, the Bambengele speak a Bantu language, yet they say they separated from each other just a few, well, they don't say a few hundred years ago, but you know, counting the generations in the stories and so on, it seems like a few hundred years ago. And the linguistic analyses seem to suggest that something around 250, 300 years ago, they separated from one another. So you have these two groups of hunter-gatherers who speak totally different languages, yet recognize their shared origins. And the BaYaka live with some Bantu groups who speak the same language as them. They speak this Ubangian language. They're called the Bomassa, the Massa. And when you ask the Massa, as I have done, you know, are you BaYaka? Or ask the BaYaka, are you Massa? Oh, no way. You know, neither of them wants to have anything to do with it. And you suddenly realize that, you know, we have become obsessed with this idea that language somehow reflects identity, when in fact, language is not about that. It's about having meaningful communicative relations with all the social creatures and beings that you want to have social relations with. So from the Bambengele perspective, language is not something which is exclusionary, elitist, or somehow just for us, but it's something which you open out and you use as a tool to acquire stuff. It's about asking for things. It's about demand sharing fundamentally. So if you're wanting to ask an antelope, you're demanding a share of an antelope, you go, meow, 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 and the antelope comes running to you. If you're demanding a share of a monkey, you speak like this. And the monkeys all come down, or the males come down out of the trees closer to you so you can shoot them. If you're asking for stuff from a Bantu farmer, well, you know, he's stupid. He's not going to work out what you're saying if you speak Bambengele. So you just mimic his language back to him, and then you get the stuff you want. And I think that, you know, it's difficult to you know, over imagine the past with any confidence. But what my suspicion is that many of these hunter-gatherer groups, they got so obsessed with getting stuff, demanding stuff from these farmers, that they adopted their languages to make it easier. And certainly my Bengele friends, when I ask why they switch languages as they're talking about different situations, they say, well, it's so much easier and safer to get stuff from these farmers if you just tell them things in ways they understand. Just as you wouldn't say to a dyker, come here, you go, meow, meow, in order for it to come. So you speak the appropriate language, and this returns to the points in the evolution of language argument that Chris and I have developed about mimesis, about you mimic back to the thing you want to have a communicative relationship or a social relationship, you mimic back their own sounds to them. And so, you know, you want a social relationship with a dyker, well, you mimic dyker sounds. You want a social relationship with a farmer, you mimic farmer sounds. And if you remain with that farmer for a long time, then you can even start adopting many of those elements of their language into your own language. And that language shift seems to happen very quickly among these hunter-gatherers because they have such a predatory approach to vocabulary. Yeah, so scaling, so that was the other question. So I was at one ceremony we attended, had about 600 people, and it lasted for 6 weeks. It was extraordinary. I mean, it was chaotic, and there was so much fighting, and that really is the problem when Bengele get together in such big groups. Because of avoidance strategy, you know, there are many unfinished businesses, and as people start consuming alcohol, they start remembering that so-and-so slept with their wife and hasn't paid the adultère, the adultery fee, and you know, a bullet sometimes, and then, you know, launches off into these big long things, or so-and-so might have poisoned my brother who died, who I loved, and there he is again, and they have ways of trying to structure the violence so that it doesn't cause too much damage. So there are all sorts of levels of escalation of violence. And certainly the most dangerous type, which is fighting with wooden staves, is I've only ever witnessed women beating men who've run amok with those wooden staves. If men start doing it, they'll break each other's skulls. It would be far too dangerous. And killing is this problem of you don't want to have been someone who's eaten other people, because combat will make you turn into a BaYaka. So people are very reluctant to cause bloodshed even in fighting, and they have these stages of violence. But the scaling up is not so much in individual events. It's this what I call the Mokundi economic area. So you have a Jengi that is being performed right across a huge region of Central Africa. And not just a Jengi, you have a whole bunch of other spirit plays, Mokundi Masana, which are performed across these linguistic boundaries between these hunter-gatherer groups. And there are many accounts of hunter-gatherers going from one country to another country to capture some of these Mokundis so they can bring them back and start performing them in their own areas. And one of the things they love doing is watching films of other people doing the spirit plays in other places, so they can glean, good techniques and other ways of doing it. So there's a sense of, and this is the civilizational idea, or the idea of a civilization. So a civilization is a civilization not because everybody speaks the same language, but because everybody shares the same culture. And that's what's happening in Central Africa, that you have this, at least, I mean, I just haven't been able to spend enough time in DRC because it's just so dangerous to travel around. But I would love to, and get a sense of how far this civilization, as I understand it in Western Central Africa, exists into the interior and towards the east. And I suspect it will be much further. It definitely extends into DRC, but how far is still unclear. So the question of scale is interesting because it does extend over thousands and thousands of kilometers. I mean, really, sort of about half the size of Western Europe. I mean, this is a vast area. So the scale is big, even though each of the nodes of that network are, relatively speaking, small, though occasionally they may come together into several hundred people. So thanks, Dor. Sorry if I went on a bit long.
Thank you very much.
Chris, do you want to say something on circumcision?
Yes.
Well, it would take us off. It would take us off.
It would take us.
But I'll just say very briefly, if I can start at one end of it. I mean, the extreme end among hunter-gatherers is what happens in a large part of Australia, which is, of course, sub-incision. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind what's going on there, because the informants at the time when the classic ethnographies were written made it very, very clear. So the secret is menstruation. Men need to menstruate, and they can't. It's very difficult for men to menstruate. But if you've had your penis sub-incised, you can do it on the right occasions, and that makes absolutely clear that menstruation is enormously powerful. And if men want power, they've got to be able to do it somehow. It's a little bit the same, I think, with childbirth. So childbirth is an enormously, amazingly magical, powerful thing which women do. And where men in their rituals need to be able to assert that we've got some power over these issues, having a say, having an intervention in childbirth is important to them. And so the thing which men do is just kind of claim that, well, yes, okay, women do give birth to babies, but they don't quite finish the job with the boys. A little bit more is going to be done, and we know how to do it, and that's circumcision.
I could add a little bit about Africans specifically, because in my PhD, I had a fairly big sample, upwards of 20 across African language groups, both female and male initiation kind of examinations and analyses. I think there's strong grounds for support for Chris's theory that circumcision comes as something analogous to menstruation, but then females also move up to circumcision and genital cutting as well. But there are cases where, like the Dogon, where boys' circumcision is called male menstruation. It's just overt. There are cases where there's collective initiations like kikuyu for both the boys and the girls that go through the same processes. And it's like step by step the same. Similarly, poro and sande. And it's very unusual for situation with the Hadza hunter-gatherers where men don't do circumcision, but girls, women do have some cutting. That's a pretty unusual one. So it's like they're emphasizing the menstruation extra. But underlying all of these rituals is a creation of a collectivity of one sex or the other sex, definitely, for sure. And it's like the circumcision part of it is it's a costly signal, but it's linked to genital bleeding very powerfully as a symbol. And I think the symbolism of menstruation is underneath it. It's kind of original ritual.
And is it most common when men are approaching puberty? Like
it really can vary, and how much colonialism's impacted, because as Jerome's showing quite young kids. So if you went to read Turner on the Ndembu, he's talking about boys of 7 or 8 getting circumcised. But then we also, in Tanzania, we talked a lot with Maasai. Of course, there's a real age set structuring with the Maasai, and there would be, you know, they're entering warriorhood, they're getting circumcised as part of that stage to become the warriors who are guarding the cattle and so on. So it really is variable. And I suspect that the age gets younger, the more there's impact of sort of outside economy and possibly that they're kind of getting hold of the kids before they get taken off elsewhere, if you like. I don't know. So it is so variable, and that's also the case with female genital mutilation as well.
Okay, so those are some very deep reflections.
Yeah, there's a lot to say on that. We have to talk more about it.
There's a couple of comments in the chat which I think, so Rosalie points out that English and Farsi are both Indo-European languages, and which is of course absolutely correct. That comparison was between Ubangian and Bantu languages, which are rather, well, they're different languages, but they are part of a similar larger language family in that way as English and Farsi are. But the Aswa and some of the groups living in the northern part of the Ituri forest, they speak Sudanic languages, which are of a quite different order to those Bantu languages, and the Ubangian languages. And so my apologies for not being fully explicit about the range and diversity of those languages. And then Mary asks, what do BaYaka do with their dead? Well, so when somebody dies, of course, everyone is very upset, but they do a long period of sort of corpse watching, where the women sing extremely moving and beautiful, mournful, polyphonic songs around the corpse, which is painted white. And everyone who's close to the dead person will cover their forehead with white. And the reason is that apparently makes you invisible to spirits. And the great fear is that that person's spirit is not yet in community. It's now at this in-between as it moves from the living to the world of the dead. And so it may be jealous of those who are still living. And so it should be, you know, the living should make themselves difficult to see, so that the spirit continues on its journey and doesn't hang around trying to get back into the living. And the fear really is that the spirit will stop people finding food if it feels unhappy or somehow left out. And so these songs and this covering is all designed to send the spirit off. And this is women's work. It's very important. This is what women do. They prepare the body, and they're regularly touching the body, regularly feeling the body. And it's important that they feel rigor mortis. You know, you don't want to bury somebody who's just in some sort of coma-y thing. You have to, you know, sit with the body for several hours till you feel it getting really cold and stiff. And then you know that person really is dead. And so men will be, wherever they decide to dig the tomb, will be digging the tomb, and they're quite concerned to make sure it goes quite deep. It has a sort of a narrow entrance, and then it opens up underneath. And it's very important that people don't lie on the earth, and I've never really quite understood why that is. So they're always buried with a sleeping mat around the body. And the ritual is, of the actual burial is very emotional, of course, but it's not particularly elaborate or have, well, maybe I haven't seen enough deaths to be able to really, fortunately, to be able to really know for sure if there are particular rituals that people do. Ingrid, I think, she was a very close friend of hers, died when I was away in the forest, and she participates. She might have more to say on that. But then once the body is buried, they just will leave a little mound, and then it's just the memories that people have of where people are buried. There's not an obvious symbol or sign left of that person. But people are very concerned that it doesn't get dug up by leopards and other animals, that it should, people should rot into the earth. They shouldn't, be dragged around or torn up by wild animals.
You got a question about?
Yeah. And then when people go back to the places, they remember them. So Ingrid, you wanted to say something.
Yes. So as to burials, when someone dies, everything that the Bengele do is about ritual behavior, and it's about really teaching morality. So if a woman dies, and so for instance, Ko, who died, a wonderful, lovely lady, you will use her implements that she used to nourish and nurture the family, to teach her, to tell her, you are now dead. You actually have to understand that you are now dead. You can no longer use these implements, because otherwise you will be feeding off the living. And so the body is buried without any earth touching it. So it has got space to be. So space is given for the dead and space is given for the living, but it is made very, very clear that a dead person is no longer allowed to continue with the living people.
Yeah.
We got a question about mental illness, how that's treated, and a question about rape or sexual harassment. Okay,
two great questions. So mental illness, yes, there are people who have various, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm be very reluctant to try and classify in any sort of meaningful sense. But my dear friend Fatah, he said to me something that I thought was very wise. He said, there are two forms of Zumwa mental illness. One is where there's too much talking in the head, and the other one is where there's no talking in the head. And I thought that was a very succinct way of summarizing a lot of mental suffering that people go through. But no, people are extremely tolerant of mental illness. Among the BaYaka, there's a community that I've spent quite a time with. And there was a wonderful man, Mopana, yes, Mopana. And Mopana, when I first arrived in the community, I thought was just one of those annoying crazies who just keeps coming in and disrupting things, wanting to fight. And he was rather aggressive and hyper energetic, just too much energy. And but then as I got to know him, I realized that he was actually an extraordinarily intelligent man. And he told me what happened to him and what his life story was, because of course he would have his moments of peaking, and then he would calm down after some days, and you could talk to him again. And so what happened to Mopana is that he was sent off by his parents to go and get educated by some missionaries, and he stayed with these missionaries till he was about 13 or 14, I presume. When something happened, which he never told me, and I do suspect the worst actually. But he just fled the mission, and from that moment on, he was never the same again. And what he did is he fled the mission, and his parents had died by this point, and he went and slept on their grave for several months. And in those months, he communed with his parents, and he found some comfort in that. And then from then on, he rejected the education he'd received. He could even speak a few words of English, and he could speak quite good French. And he just remained, occasionally having rather serious bouts of drunkenness in which he would get into terrible fights, and he'd lost all his front teeth, for instance. But what was interesting was that at one point they trapped an elephant, and a trapped elephant is an extremely dangerous creature. And the way that a trapped, I wasn't there at this time, people told me about it, but the way you deal with a trapped elephant is, so this is a cable that is now around its foot and it's stuck in the forest. And the old men bring all the spears that they can find. They build fires around the elephant, and the young men then have to charge in and stab the elephant. And of course you need to coordinate, because that trunk is so dangerous as it swirls around that it's extremely easy to get caught by it. And so, there's a certain thrusting and, double timing and so on that goes on to get the spears in. And, but as this elephant gets increasingly angry and wounded, it becomes increasingly dangerous to do any of this. And suddenly that's where Mopana, with his psychotic tendencies, just was the man everyone wanted. And they, made huge efforts to call him in, because with his sort of, just charged up strength, he would, and just reckless courage, he would be the one who would actually go in and finish the work of the elephant. And what it made me realize is that in these sorts of contexts, again, I'm getting into language which I should be careful of, but the sort of psychopathic tendencies that Mopana had were actually really desirable in that moment for finishing the elephant. And so, what we consider as antisocial, or, something that needs to be locked up and kept out of society's way, in those contexts can suddenly become something that's actually very desirable for society. And so understanding madness from sort of Western typologies and is not, it doesn't work in that context. So, and then there are other forms of madness. There was with alcohol now becoming a really big problem. It's mostly homebrewed alcohol, and occasionally people drink this sort of methylated liquor, which just destroys their brains literally over a weekend. And that really is tragic. And there was one very wonderful woman who was a brilliant speaker, Mainja, and she gave me some really wonderful quotes, which I use in various published things I've done. And she just got drunk over a weekend, and after that she just lost it completely. And from being a wonderful mother, a loving auntie, she became this really angry, aggressive person who was very difficult to cope with, who kept running off into the forest to the huge sort of anxiety of her family, and just disappearing for days and days at a time. And eventually she just never came back, and nobody knew what had happened to her, but everyone presumed she was dead. So people are very caring, understanding, and they try really hard to accommodate people who have various issues of mental health. But sometimes, it's just too much, doesn't work. So Mopana, for instance, unfortunately is now dead. He died much too early, but probably, in one of his worst episodes, he got really sick, and it just finished him off. So yeah, so too much talk and too little talk. That's the way. And then there are plants and treatments like that. One of my friends, as a boy, he lost his laughter, and this was considered to be a very serious issue by his family. And so he said they did a ritual in which his family all encircled him around a tree, and he had to, and it was a particular tree that is used for healing this, and he had to run around the tree with his family, all doing these really sort of comical, hilarious things as he ran around, until he laughed to the point that he wet himself. And once that had happened, they stopped, and then he had his laughter back. so so they, you know, anyway, these are very random, piecemeal, but the problem with a lot of these things is that, you know, I've only really spent time with perhaps 300 or 400 Bambangele, and although I'm familiar with a population of, we are familiar with a population of around 15-20,000 people, of course we don't know the life histories and the intimate details of more than a few hundred people. So it becomes very difficult to generalize on these big issues, you know, that in populations of several millions of people, you see emerge with much more frequency than you do in very small populations like this. Has witnessed or heard of any incidents of rape or sexual harassment amongst the BaYaka? Well, I guess, you know, perhaps what African men tend to be much more, at least in Congo, prone to the sorts of things that would be interpreted here as sexual harassment without feeling that what they're doing is sexually harassing women. So some of the very rude banter, there's certainly lots of groping and grabbing of women in certain contexts that I've witnessed. So it certainly goes on. It's much less with the Bambangele, and it's also much more, or much less macho, let's say. Anyway, so the question of where you draw the line of what is legitimate interaction between genders and what is sexual harassment is perhaps the point that would need to be made in more detail, and not something that I've really thought through carefully enough, to be honest, to answer that confidently. Questions of rape. There have certainly been rapes by farmer men of BaYaka women, and some very serious serial rapists who remain at large because they're relatives of some local prefet or something, and there's some really horrifically nasty situations, also with school teachers and you know, manipulating their power to maintain all sorts of nasty relationships with young girls. But among sort of BaYaka themselves, I've never heard of a situation of rape. I mean, maybe Ingrid has, and she can share that with us, but I haven't come across a BaYaka man raping a BaYaka woman. I mean, people are much more relaxed about having sex in BaYaka society. So young people, for instance, are encouraged to have lots of sex. It's seen as a healthy thing to do as a young person, to know your sexual body. It's something to educate yourself about and know other people's sexual bodies. It's an important part of growing up, of the skills of being human. And so one of my students, her boyfriend, they split up, and he was with her in the field and he left, and she had this big tent and nobody in it. And so the kid said, "Oh, come on, can we stay with you?" And she said, "Okay, yeah, come in." And to her shock and surprise, they spent most of the night making love to each other. And not just in a secretive way, but in a very sort of public way. "Oh, his one's really nice. Have you seen what it's like?" And, "Oh, his one's not so good." And, you know, she was very surprised by this, and you know, she sort of wrote to me, you know, "Should I include this in my notes? What, you know, how can this be?" And in the end, she didn't write it up because she thought it would be too easily misunderstood and misinterpreted by Westerners. But that freedom to sexually experiment, to explore your sexual self and the sexual selves of others, is something which means that, well, I think physical violence associated with sex would be something people would reject forcefully. And certainly any violence against women is rejected very forcefully, certainly by women and others. And I can see that Ingrid has something she wants to say, so go on.
So first of all, like the BaYaka say, sex is fun. And look, let's name it. We are all here, every single one of us, because, you know, there was a sexual encounter between a man and a woman. It is number of aphrodisiacs that you could probably find, or at least as far as our research goes. But I have done and I came across those years, only one in
a
young BaYaka man would have. And the women who surrounded that woman that happened to sought him out. And they said what they did is they took pieces of wood, hardwood. So firewood is used when you fight as a sort of a big display because it's soft and, you know, you beat someone with it, you can't ever kill. But hardwood, you could kill somebody with it. And the women ganged up on this man, used that wood to beat his genitals so that he could not do that again. So this is the only incidents that I ever heard about in all those years that a BaYaka man would have done that. Whereas, as Jerome already said, incidences of Bantu men, of the sedentary neighbors against trespasses, sexual trespasses by them against women are well known. And here again, you know, it is the community who guides it, who helps it and helps these. So to really sum it up, to say this, human characters all over the world are the same. So you have got the happy-go-lucky, you have got the really serious, you have got the philosophers, you have got, you know, the clowns. But the way that people deal with others, the human systems that have been put in place, that's what's so different. And this is what is so refreshing amongst the BaYaka, how they support one another as a community and how they help each other heal.
Okay, thanks, Ingrid.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes before 8:30.
Well, there was one question from Dor, which I forgot to answer, actually. Who decides on which Ajengi to dance when you've got so many guardians in a community? And this was interesting. This was given as one of the explanations for why I should become I'm a guardian of Ajengi too, and indeed Ingrid is a guardian of Ngoku and of Yele. But it's that if you are the guardian of the Ajengi that's called, you need to make sure that everything Ajengi demands will be available, because Ajengi is a very hungry spirit and he will always be asking for stuff. And so if so for instance, if someone in my clan dies, then it's my Ajengi which has to be summoned in order to cleanse and reconstitute society after that rupture. So Ingrid and I were just in Congo last December, and a very dear friend of ours, Mongemba, had died, and we had to run the ending of mourning ceremony for him. And if I had to ask another guardian to call their Ajengi to do that, I would have just been, you know, everything I would have owned or had present on me would be removed from my, you know, it would be demanded from me. I'd have nothing left at the end, not even the clothes on my back. And so the reason why every clan has its own, is guardian to its own set of spirits, is so that we are ritually independent of one another. I don't depend on any other person for whatever ritual needs I require, nor does Ingrid, of course. So our Lewisi clan is able to do all the ritual things it needs to do when it needs to do them without depending on anyone else. And so that's why there are so many guardians. And my friend Emeka, he told me, he said, yeah, in the past, there were just so many fights if people weren't guardians and they had to get help from other guardians and they couldn't because they didn't have enough stuff. So then they'd just do it anyway, and the other guardian would hear about it, and then it would cause a big fight. And so everyone ended up becoming guardians themselves. So that's really how it works. It's what the reason for the ritual is that will determine which guardian calls their Ajengi or not. And sometimes, you know, you call several Ajengis at once, which is really quite spectacular, and that can be quite something. But then, boy, you better have a lot of stuff. Yeah.
On who dances Ajengi, because it reminds me of Victor Turner's incredible dissection of Mukanda, the Ndembu, of how they decide which men of which matrilineages are going to be the senior circumcisers in the lodge, the senior official of the lodge for the boys' initiation. And I'm just saying that Jerome should really write, he could write a classic, a great anthropology classic on, like Victor Turner's, on the politics of the organization of the rituals, not the rituals themselves. I just that observation, but yeah.
Well, thanks, Camilla. Get more, make more time. I've got so many things I need to write down.
Yeah, right. I know, so much. Yeah.